Hello, Rabiya. Welcome to IP Voices, the international interview series highlighting creative minds behind brands and innovation. I am super pleased that you have accepted to join me today so we can learn more about you, your background, and hear what you have to say about brands and innovation. So thank you so much. You're joining us from New Jersey in the United States. So before we start, I will take a few minutes to first introduce you properly.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. You are a registered U.S. patent attorney and founder and CEO of Kader IP, which is your own IP consultancy through which you support technology, startups, and entrepreneurs to protect their intellectual property. Your career actually started as a mechanical engineer for J&J, Johnson & Johnson, to then become a patent attorney, first working with U.S. law firms, and then working in-house in various roles of increasing responsibilities over the years. First, you were at L'Oreal, then you went to Sanofi, and then its spun-off business, Opella. This is where actually we had an opportunity to meet. And in your last role at Sanofi and Opella, you were the global head of intellectual property for the consumer healthcare brands. You have led global teams and global intellectual property strategy for patents, trademarks, copyright, and domain names, and managed prosecution, litigation, and transaction for very complex, highly regulated businesses. So I'm super excited to have a chance to interview you today, and I can't wait to learn more about you and your experience. And so I'm going to go right in with my first question, which is linked to your bio, actually. So could you give the audience a little bit more flavor about the brands and innovation you've supported?
Thanks again. I really appreciate being able to speak with you today. So I will give you some of the names that I think are more well known in the consumer healthcare space. So in the United States, Allegra, which is an allergy product, Icy Hot, which is a topical pain product. In Europe, I worked on Doliprane, which is very well known in France, and then also in Terra Germana and Essenziale, to just name a few of the big brands that I've worked on.
Thank you so much. And so I've said in your bio that you actually are, at the beginning, you started your career as a mechanical engineer. So how does a mechanical engineer become then global head of IP? I would love to hear what first pulled you into the world of intellectual property.
Yes. So I always had an interest in law. Being an immigrant to the United States, I didn't know any lawyers. I didn't know how to become a lawyer. And so I went the science route. And so I became an engineer. And when I started working at Johnson & Johnson, I actually started there in their consumer products division. And I met a patent attorney there. And she was very generous with her time and spoke with me. And that's when I learned that I could still go to law school. And so I worked at J&J for 2 years as an engineer. And then I prepared for the law school entrance exams, and then I applied, and then I decided that I was going to focus entirely on law school, and so I went to law school full time and left my engineering position at J&J, and actually for me it has been the best decision that I've made.
And how does the engineering background helped you in your IP role?
Well, to be a registered patent attorney in the United States and most of the rest of the world, you have to have a science or engineering degree. So not everybody can do it. So it's a very highly specialized world. But I do find that when you're working with engineers and scientists, when you tell them that you have an engineering background or a science background, they feel that they can relate to you better. You're not just any lawyer coming in and telling them, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. They see you as a co-scientist or a co-engineer. So I think it brings out, you're more legitimate to them and they trust you more. And they know that you can relate to the sciences and you can relate to the technology topics. So I think it definitely helps in that sort of relatability aspect. But absolutely, if you have the science back, you can understand the technology better and speak their language better. So, and patent law is so highly specialized now. You have life science attorneys that have PhDs, and then you have software attorneys that have a computer science background or electrical engineering background. So, when you get to that level, you really need to understand the science. And so therefore, the science and the engineering is critical.
Thank you for that. So, what do you find the most rewarding about operating at the intersection of business, creativity, and law?
I love being at the forefront of the science. I love learning about new technologies. And what really attracted me to patent law was when I was at J&J, seeing how much development went into launching a product. Having just been a teenager, you just go to the store and you see the products, or you go to the pharmacy and you get something. Most people don't realize how much work and science and development goes into putting the product into your hands. And so it was an eye opener for me working at J&J to see how much development went into consumer healthcare products. And then, of course, as I moved into my positions at L'Oreal and then a prescription side with Sanofi, I became really amazed at the length of time that is spent on developing products, as well as the amount of effort. I always love the products. I love consumer healthcare because you can see the products on the shelf. Sometimes on the pharma side, a lot of drug development fails, so you may never see your product get approved. And so that can be really frustrating. You can spend 10 years and your product fails trials, and people don't understand that that is a risk, in the prescription market. But yes, so I really love the science behind it, the development behind it, and of course, problem solving. Cost plays an important part in what is launched eventually. If you don't get reimbursement by the government healthcare systems, or if the Walmarts and the Costcos of the world decide they don't want to put your product on the shelf, right? So you're constantly working with the business aspect, the science aspect, and then the legal challenges of getting something approved by the FDA, or, going through claims reviews and things like that. And of course, patents.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you for this. So now we're moving on to more of a understanding of non-legal influence, maybe something, I don't know, it could be an artwork, it could be a film, it could be
Mhm.
anything really that inspires you and inspires how you work.
I read this book, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, in my
Yeah.
20s. Yes. And, I'm a little far removed, but I actually did pick it up again a few years ago because I think it was more relevant. But that book always stayed with me. I loved Stephen Covey's focus on do something that is aligned with your goals every week. He has you plan your week on your spiritual goals, your physical goals, not just tasks to be completed. And I always love that focus. Every Sunday night, I try to think about, well, when am I going to fit in some physical activity? When am I going to fit in time for my friends and family? So I love that. Another aspect that has always stuck with me is your circle of influence, your circle of control. So if you can control something, great. Think about it and what you can control. Perhaps then, the circle widens and it's a circle of influence, but you cannot control it. So, okay, then maybe try to see if you can influence the outcome. But if it's outside of those two things, try not to worry about it, right? So if you can't control it, you can't influence it. So I've always loved that analogy from that book. And one more thing that I always think about is active listening. So many times people are just listening, and you can even see their eyes glaze over because all they're thinking about is responding. What are they going to say as soon as you stop talking?
Mhm.
And that was another element in his book that I really appreciated, where you really should listen to what somebody is saying before thinking about what you're going to say next. So I love that book. I really related to that book, and it has served me well for a very long time.
So thank you. I think it will resonate with a lot of us. And so now we're moving on to, I would say, business partnership. You've worked with many business
Yes.
leaders and all types of business colleagues, actually. So I would love to hear what is your perspective on creating effective business partnership, but also, how to be seen also as a creative business partner. I would love to hear your insights on that.
I spend a lot of time building relationships with my clients, even if it's a coffee chat, because I think that often the scientists and engineers are so busy meeting their KPIs and their goals, they don't often think about IP. And so when that happens, that can be really detrimental to the long-term success of the business. Sometimes, and I've seen this happen, the technical teams will start working with a supplier or a vendor or an external partner without having put an agreement in place or having even signed an NDA. building those relationships, inserting yourself into their day, teaching them the value of IP, teaching them the value of bringing issues to the attorneys before they become a major problem. I think those are really, really important. So building those relationships and then finding ways to teach them and explain to them the value of why we need to bring in the lawyers as early as possible. I think that's really important. And so that is like a bottom up process where you engage all the junior level folks, entry level folks, the bench scientists and engineers, and then also educating your top leaders and showing them the larger value of things. When you go to do a deal, one of the first questions is, do you have any IP? Do you have any patents? Because that completely changes the valuation. It becomes much more valuable when you have IP. And, certainly in the pharma space, it's patent cliffs. I mean, we talk about it all the time. And so getting their buy-in, because as much as you might be able to educate the junior scientists and the engineers, if top-down leadership doesn't support their activities to come and meet with you, it's going to be an uphill battle. So really educating them, showing them the value, and sometimes case studies of what's happening in the external market. Right? You see, I would often send them New York Times articles on certain things that I would see in papers about IP, or how a business, perhaps didn't fare well because they didn't focus on IP, or there was a patent infringement case that was had a negative result, or if they did find a reformulation and now they had gone on to more success in reformulation or a different device, showing them external case studies in addition to your own inside case studies as well, but showing them examples, I think, is really, really helpful to get the business on board.
Thank you. So now the flip side of that is how working closely with creative and R&D colleagues has shaped your leadership style, or has maybe changed you professionally.
I believe in trusting people. I think when people feel that you have confidence in their abilities, they perform better. And so I don't micromanage. I'm not asking you about, did you do this task? Did you do that task? I expect you to have done it. And then if we have any issues that you want to talk about, then we talk about it. And then we think about, how do we solve this problem? So I really believe in trusting people to do their best. I think that people are well-intentioned. They want to do good work. They want to be recognized. And so, if you support them and show confidence in their abilities, I think you get the best result.
One of the great thing about IP is the international nature of the IP ecosystem. And so every region will approach brands and innovation differently. So where do you see the biggest divergence? Have you seen maybe the biggest divergence in your area of expertise? And how does maybe the difference affect how global companies operate?
Yes. Well, I think, the global south or less developed nations or less wealthy nations have a very different approach to IP and healthcare. I mean, this is well known, where to them it's more about access and cost. So I think, when you're thinking about a global launch, that is one of the first factors that you consider, pricing and access. And so, you're really focused almost on a commodity level type of scaling there, right? How to get the products into their hands and solve a problem. Whereas I would say in the global north, the more developed, wealthy countries, it's more about brands and brand love and marketing and advertising, and you might have a little bit more flexibility with respect to cost. And so I think it's a very different analysis when you're thinking about different regions.
The other interesting aspect about working internationally is dealing with people internationally. So the question I wanted to also ask you is how working globally has shaped your worldview, but also, do you have any particular tips for collaborating effectively across cultures?
Yes. Again, I really think about trying to connect with people. When I was at Opella, of course, it was a global team. We had teams in Australia, Vietnam, Japan. So, setting up those calls, being willing to meet them at their time zone, because I used to try to, of course, you try to meet people during your preferred time, which is perhaps not so preferred in Australia, but trying to meet them during their preferred times, they always appreciated that. So I could stay up late. I could call somebody at 11 o'clock at night, and to make it easier for them to meet with you. So that to me is really important. And then again, teaching them and explaining to them the nuances between, what might be different in Australia or Japan versus what might be different in the US. I think they get a better perspective. That's also really, really helpful. And then trying to learn their law. So take as many classes as you can, keep as updated as possible, whether you sign up for emails from local law firms and things like this. Try to learn their laws and their procedures. And then finally, find local help. You're not going to be an expert on every aspect of law, every aspect of everything in a different region. And so having those contacts, having local people that you can rely on. I remember, searching far and wide for a regulatory expert in Brazil. And so, you can't be expected to know regulatory law in Brazil. So you have to find those contacts and develop those relationships so that you can actually call them up and say, hey, I have a quick question. Can we talk about this? So meeting them in their time zone, having that discourse and having that relationship is really, really helpful.
So now I'm actually curious about, obviously, when you were working in-house, how did you best manage you in-house outside counsel relationship when they were from different cultures? Did you do anything special to enhance that relationship besides the fact that you were the client? Obviously, it's always easier in that context. But do you have any other tips for effective collaboration?
Meeting people in person. That's why INTA and some of these international meetings are so helpful. Meeting them in person, having a coffee, having a face-to-face. People are so different once you've met with them. And being from a global company, often you don't even get to see your colleagues more than once a year. You could be on Zoom calls with them every day, and it's a different relationship. Once you meet them and have a coffee, have a glass of wine, it is a very different relationship afterwards. And so I think taking the opportunity to meet with people as much as possible really changes the dynamics of everything.
Absolutely. So now we're going to move on to an IP challenge. Is there an IP challenge you can share with us where you had to be exceptionally creative? And maybe what was the creative insight that made a real difference?
Yes. So there was an incident of or an accusation of patent infringement. And, we can go down the technical roots of, well, let's see if we do infringe or if we don't infringe. I'm going to review the patent and I'm going to look at their file history. Did they pay their fees? So there's the analysis of the patent infringement aspect. But what was also very interesting was that we found that the other side had been marketing their product for a use that had not yet been approved. And so it was outside the scope of, the patent infringement action, but we were able to go to them and point this out to them and say, hello, you're advertising for something that has not been approved yet. And they quickly went away. We didn't hear from them again. And so stepping back and looking at the entire, maybe there's a regulatory aspect, there is something else that is just outside of a patent infringement action. And so that was a really creative way to approach it. And it was thanks to local folks that were on the ground that saw this advertisement and marketing and brought it to our attention. So it was very creative and everybody was really paying attention. So that was fantastic.
That's great. Yes. And I guess in this case also, like you said, definitely stepping back, looking at the bigger picture, but also, I guess, working effectively with other teams throughout, the company to get to the best outcome, right? That's wonderful. And sometimes the best defense is a great offense.
Yes, absolutely.
I hope not too often, but
Right.
in this case, I guess it
Yes.
worked out. So now, I mean, from your patent perspective, I think this question is going to be very easy to answer because maybe for me, who've been more on the brand side of things, brand value is always hard to define. And often people point out to patents, to technology. So I'd love to hear from you about what do you think gives a brand a value today, and how does IP, but broad IP, shape that value? Not just patents, not just trademarks. I would love to hear your views on that.
I even just yesterday, saw a LinkedIn post talking about the success of Kirkland brand, which is, for people that may not be from the United States, is Costco's house brand. And they have amassed a tremendous following. They have good products. And I think they have fit themselves in where they find, Costco obviously has a lot of metrics. They know what's selling, what's not selling. And so they're able to look at their business and say, well, maybe there's a need here for Kirkland brand olive oil or Kirkland brand peanut butter. I mean, it could be some, staples that people want to buy, but perhaps don't want to pay extra. And so apparently Kirkland has done a fantastic job of providing really good quality alternatives but just a little bit under the brand pricing. And they've built a tremendous following. And so what this tells me is that sometimes the brands, when they have their foundational products, sometimes ignore them and don't renovate or innovate or produce any sort of trademark, or sort of branding redesign. And so those foundational products get ignored, and then a Kirkland brand comes in and takes that out from underneath them. So, for example, Oreos. We all know and love Oreos, but they're continuing to renovate. You'll see orange Oreos during Halloween. You see green Oreos during, St. Patrick's Day. So they have maintained brand love, but also continue to offer new and innovative items for their consumers. And so I think Oreos have done a fantastic job. But the Kirkland example is certainly a warning to a lot of major companies to say, keep renovating, offer something new for your consumers, but keep the base as well and focus on the base.
Yes, very good advice. Those iconic products that everybody loves, but often are maybe not ignored, but maybe they're not as focused on, and then they go for the big innovation, trying to crack the
Yes,
next big thing, while maybe their very good staple brands are
they're taken for
not
granted.
focused on. Now, what's one thing you wish more business colleagues, leaders understood about the IP ecosystem?
Yes. So I recently read an article from MIT Sloan on innovation and IP, and something really caught my eye. And they said only 5% of leaders' time was focused on the future. And that really struck me because I do think that, those of us in the IP world, we see the IP issues and we're kind of mired in the IP issue. And we think, oh, everybody's spending time on IP. But apparently, leaders are not spending that much time on IP. And so I think that top leadership has to think about the future. And what you may miss today might come back to haunt you 10 years from now. Maybe you didn't think that you needed to do a freedom to operate, but 10 years later, you might have a patent infringement action. Or you didn't file a patent application on something because you had limited resources. And then 10 years later, somebody is, or even 5 years later, somebody is copying you and you have no way to stop them. And so thinking about the future and planning for the future, I have seen this so many times. Cost is always a factor. Especially with smaller biotechs, they want to focus on the science, and they want to have good clinical studies and good results. But if they're not protecting their development, it might be for naught 5 years later, 10 years later, and then you're dealing with it later. And another aspect is you can't be thinking about your next product when you're in ANDA litigation. You have to be thinking about your next product when the first one gets approved, not 5 years later. And so thinking about the future, planning for the future, putting processes in place now to protect you in the future, I think if I could get that message across from top down, I think, that would be the most critical message.
Yes, and it's actually a very concerning statistics. Actually, it's interesting because you hear always businesses thinking about strategy, long-term strategy, and in the end, uh, for that's very small number of leaders
Yeah,
thinking about the
I was
future.
very
So you're
surprised
right.
by that.
Shocking. Yeah,
Yes.
it is shocking. Yeah. But at the same time, I think it illustrates the tension that we all feel because exactly right. Because when you're in the IP ecosystem, you're thinking long term, brand building, long term innovation. So at the same time, you have to protect the short term innovations as well. It's not that, we do both, but it's definitely a long term gain,
Yeah.
long term game. And so it's interesting that you highlighted that because I think it's definitely concerning to many of us,
Yes.
the short-term views. So now I would like to ask a question about if you can share a moment from your career that actually illustrate the real impact of protecting an idea, a brand, an innovation, a creative work. And maybe I'm sure that you have some good example given your background in patents.
Yes, the team was working on a very cool product, but forgot to put an NDA in place, forgot to put a co-development in place. They were just moving so quickly. And fortunately, someone said, I wonder if we can file patents on this. And that's what it was brought to my attention. And so trying to unwind the clock is a little bit difficult. And now the valuation is very different, right? When you enter a fresh new co-development agreement, you might have more leverage. You can say, I want to own it. I'm going to pay less. We'll see. But once the other side knows that you love the product, price goes up and they become a little bit more difficult to deal with. And so I think it was a very valuable lesson for the team. And, we were able to work it out, and the product is now on the market and it's fabulous. And I love it. And I take a lot of pride in seeing it on the shelves. But it was a challenging a few months trying to work with that other partner. But eventually, we helped them realize that working with us now would, be better for their long-term relationship. We'd want to work with them again in the future. And so then we were able to work it out.
Wonderful. What has been one of your toughest challenge as an IP professional, and what did it teach you about the work, or about maybe yourself?
Yes, there are certainly some people in leadership who value patents and trademarks and will invest in that. And then there are some that don't value patents or trademarks and don't invest in that. You can sometimes try your best to persuade them of the value, but ultimately, some people are not easily persuaded, and they make business decisions and with their limited resources and decide to focus elsewhere. And sometimes you just can't persuade them and cannot get them to buy in, and that is life, unfortunately.
That is life. And did you learn something from that? Is there some a learning for others who go through this difficult challenge of not being able to persuade a leader about the value of the work that you do?
Well, and this is where the circle of control and circle of influence comes in from Stephen Covey's teachings, right? Where you can control, you try. Where you can influence, you try. And then ultimately, you have to step back and let it play out, and let them live with their decisions.
Yes, yes, for sure. Very wise advice. I would love to hear about how do you see the world of IP evolving, and what do you see as the next big challenge? Obviously, a lot of people would say or have answered AI, but maybe it's your answer. Is there something, what do you see as the next big challenge for the
Well,
IP ecosystem?
I think a conversation in 2026 cannot go by without saying AI. I just don't ever see it anymore. And so I think from an IP lens, it's going to be really interesting to see people innovating with AI. But, in the world of patent law, you still need human conception to be considered an inventor and to have a patent. So it's going to be really interesting in the next couple of years to see if there's litigation on inventorship and dealing with how much AI was incorporated into your inventions and how much AI played into the invention concept. Every few years there's a trend. I remember when I was at L'Oreal, the trend was false marking. You didn't update your patent number on your mascara products. It was there was an intent to deceive. And so there were a lot of cases around that. Then they kind of disappeared. And then you had the patrol activity, and then that disappeared. So I think in the next couple of years, you will see some cases coming about, well, how much AI was used. That's my humble opinion. So I think that that's going to be really interesting to keep an eye on. And with so much AI, I wonder if patent laws will change to accommodate more AI usage, right? And start attributing inventions to AI. So I think there may be some changes there. Also on the trademark branding marketing side, the use of a lot of AI in your advertising and marketing, rather than go out and hiring models for a variety of different cultures and regions, maybe you just hire one AI model and change the features. And so I think that's going to be really interesting to see as well. The younger generation really thinks of it as AI slop. So I wonder if brands might be turning off some younger folks with sort of taking one AI model and modifying it, and people might be seeking more genuine, authentic advertising and marketing. So that's going to be really interesting to see as well what brands end up doing.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And what about the profession itself? Do you think, what is your perspective on a lot of, obviously lots of professionals are worried about AI and the impact on the workforce. Any words on
Yes.
that for the patent or the IP lawyers?
Yes. I mean, I'm very much worried about it because I have two college age children and I send them everything I can on AI. And suggestions on where they should focus their careers and college years. It is going to be very challenging. I'm aware of, certain companies that have internship programs that they have cut by 50%. And that is very troubling. I just had a conversation with somebody yesterday that said, he's a litigator and he was working on discovery and trying to catalog some discovery materials. And, they used AI and it was done in half an hour, where it would have taken some other junior attorneys or paralegals weeks to do that. That is terrifying. But what is also really interesting is that now you're using AI and might be a little bit cheaper, but once you've eliminated your workforce in a year or two, the AI companies, I think, are going to charge a lot more money to do that work. And now you're going to be paying the AI companies and not your workforce. So from that perspective, I'm very, very concerned about it. I think the senior level folks who have been trained and have the analytical abilities um, will be okay for the short term, but the companies are not thinking long term when they go to reducing junior level folks, because then how are you going to train them to be there 10 years from now to see the issues and to deal with those issues? I think there's going to be a brain drain in about 10 years.
And that goes back to your futures comment, because you're not just thinking about the future. What's the future workforce looking like? So the decision you're making now will impact you in 10 years. But are you thinking about it, or are you just not, worried about it so much? Because
Right.
again, we're not looking at the future. We're not focusing on the future.
We are not. And I have been to several AI conferences and sessions, and I have asked the panels what is being done to think about this future. And everybody keeps turning it to, well, you need to train better. You need to think about how you want to work with AI. Colleges need to start thinking about it. But nobody has yet answered the question, what are companies doing in anticipation of this brain drain? Nobody has answered that question to me. And I think that companies need to think about the long-term consequences of short-term profit margins.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. So, Rabia, before we move to the last question, I just wanted to ask you one more question. In light of your mostly the early mechanical engineer background and patent background, so heavily technical background in IP, I wanted to ask you, what was the most surprising or the most rewarding expanding to other non-patent IP when you became a global head of IP for your prior employers?
Well, I think trademarks and copyrights are far more fun than patents. On the patent side, you're looking at antibodies or devices and how to describe a device in a very particular manner, and reading 100-page patents. Trademarks are so much more fun. They're more visual. You get to see the logo in a commercial, maybe on TV. So much more fun. And you get to see the branding when you walk into the shops. And copyrights too. I was the copyright expert at Sanofi for some time, and explaining to our scientists that we cannot take an image and reproduce it for our purposes. It's a commercial use. Trademarks and copyrights are a lot more fun than all the technical patents.
You didn't really apply any type of hierarchy, right? Because I do feel, in this IP ecosystem, there is a bit of a divide between the what I call soft IP, and the patent lawyers or the patent professionals.
I get your point. I didn't deal with them differently or give it less importance, except for the fact that if you make certain mistakes on the patent side, you completely lose protection. So you weighted things maybe a little bit differently just because there's loss of value if you made certain mistakes. Whereas on the trademark side, there's a lot more forgiving. You can still file for a trademark application even after you start using the name on the product.
Yes.
And then on the copyright side, it's not a $1 billion mistake. It never is. So I think that purely from that aspect, you might focus a little bit more on patents, but I certainly thought of all of them as being very important.
That totally makes sense, because the brand, everybody works on the brand in the company. It's enterprise wide. Whereas, right, you make a mistake on the patent, you compromise the value of that technology.
Yes.
So totally get that.
Yeah. Yeah.
The rights are so different.
Yeah.
You can't really compare them. They just
Right.
holistically, fit together to really bring the overall value for a company. So I think, it's a mistake to separate them when they really need to be closely looked at
Yes.
holistically and together. So now, Rabia, last but not least, at this stage of your professional journey, if you had to sum up the value of your work and your career in IP in one sentence or a few words, what would it be?
Adding future value. I think that, as we discussed today, if you don't protect or focus on your innovation today, it may come back to haunt you 10 years later or 5 years later. And so you have to think about innovation. You have to think about protecting your innovation. And so you may not see the value today or tomorrow, but I think you will realize it later. Adding future value.
Rabia, it's really been a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to share some of your thoughts with me today. You're my first patent expert on this interview series. I'm really happy that you're the first one, especially because you have dealt with all IP. So I think you're a great guest for this series. So thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I'm honored that I'm your first patent expert.